You've been briefed on this plan that Treasury is putting forward, working out with Congress. How confident are you that this is going to work?
Well, I don't think it's completely a plan yet. What we have is a request, a massive amount of money that the Treasury would have discretion over, and we know that it's going to potentially take a while to work this thing out. We haven't seen all the details, but we have to remember, first of all, how we got here. We had years of regulators looking the other way. We had, I believe, an economic theory that's failed that says anything goes at the top and we're not going to worry about what's happening on Main Street. Regardless of how we got there, we now have a situation where people's jobs, people's savings, people's retirement accounts, their job security, all that is at risk. And so we've got to take some firm, decisive steps. I think that it has to be bold, and I am supportive of the need for quick action. But there's some principles that I think have to be included. Number one, I think we have to have oversight. I don't think it can be a blank check. We can set up a system where there's an independent overseer, maybe the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Democrats and the Republicans each appoint somebody to oversee the system. But we have to make sure that there's some accountability mechanism in it. A second principle that we have to have is that taxpayers have to share in the upside of this process. If we are buying up assets and are eventually selling them, we want to make sure that it's structured in a way that taxpayers aren't left holding the bag and it ends up costing a lot more than it should. Third principle is that we've got to have relief for the homeowners. The underlying problem in this whole situation is that home values are declining, foreclosures are going haywire. We've got to make sure that we're addressing that underlying problem and that relief flows to homeowners and it's not just a bailout for Wall Street. And the fourth principle that I think is important is that as we increase liquidity in the system, as we restore market confidence, that we're also making sure that CEOs and executives, large investors, that they are not walking away with billions of dollars in profits or added value. I think there's got to be some constraints on what they benefit in terms of making sure that the program works and the taxpayers aren't paying for multi-million-dollar bonuses.
It looks as if there's the bipartisan will to move this through quickly in Congress. And if that happens, then the government will have just taken on $700 billion of obligations that you haven't planned on throughout your 2-year campaign for president. So how do you adjust your agenda in light of that, whether it's the scale of your plans for spending on health care, energy, or other issues, whether it's on the advisability of raising taxes on capital gains and dividends, even staffing your administration? Would you ask Hank Paulson, for example, to stay on as Treasury Secretary?
Well, I'll take the last question first. I think that the transition from the current administration to the next one is going to be something we've got to pay a lot of attention to, not just because of the financial crisis, but also because we're in the middle of 2 wars and we are still vulnerable to terrorist attacks. So without saying specifically what we'll do, I think it's important to make sure that that transition is seamless and that we pass the baton effectively.
Would you consider having Paulson stay on?
I would certainly want to make sure that Paulson was involved in the transition. That doesn't necessarily mean that he'd end up being Secretary of Treasury, but I think it's important for us to make sure that those who are currently in charge when it comes to the financial crisis and defense and intelligence, that they are deeply involved in the transition process. When it comes to the issues of my long-term economic plan, look, here's what we've got. We've got an immediate crisis that has to be dealt with. And I think it's important for us to act in a bipartisan fashion, to act swiftly and decisively, and not get too bogged down with a lot of partisan wrangling. But what we have to remember is how we got into this problem in the first place. Contrary to what John McCain says, the fundamentals of the economy are not sound. The problem that we have in part has to do with wages and incomes that have been flat, and so homeowners and ordinary families out there have been working very hard, but it's tough for them to pay the bills and stay afloat with rising gas prices and health care. So if we don't address our long-term competitiveness, if we don't address some of the inequities in the tax code, if we're not addressing some of the things that weakened the family budget then we're not, over the long term, going to solve these larger problems in the financial markets.
Does that mean you can do everything that you have been campaigning on and spend $700 billion on this bailout?
Here's what I think we have to do. I do think that we're going to have to change our tax code in the ways that I've described so that we are giving a middle-class tax cut. 95% of families have more money in their pockets. That allows them to save more, pay down some of their credit card bills, deal with rising gas prices, deal with rising food prices. That has a stimulative effect that will help to create jobs, that will help the small business owner, retail sales. I believe that that is very important. Now, I think it's important to pay for it, which means that it's time for us to close some of these tax havens and loopholes that haven't contributed to growth in the economy overall. In fact, what they've contributed to are outsized profits that have gone into some of these risky instruments that have ended up getting us into financial trouble.
And what about on the spending side?
Well, on the spending side, I think it's going to be important for us to deal with the health care crisis.
So no change in your health care plan?
Well, but keep in mind, my health care plan is paid for. And I continue to believe that rolling back the Bush tax cuts on the wealthiest Americans makes sense. They are still going to be wealthy after those are rolled back. I still believe that it is important for us to make college more affordable. And I think it's important that all those things are paid for in light of this huge additional potential expense. One last point I want to make, though, on what Secretary Paulson is proposing. If this is done properly, then the expenditure should not be $700 billion. But that's why it's important to have oversight. That's why it's important that taxpayers participate in the upside. And we have to make sure that we have an overall strategy that is helping Main Street with the same sense of urgency as we're helping Wall Street. I don't want us to get bogged down over the next week in dealing with what is a severe crisis. We've got to unlock the credit markets. We've got to restore liquidity. We've got to help the banks recapitalize. But we can't simply do that and then go back to business as usual.
Well, speaking of that, you can't legislate against bubbles. Right. You can't legislate against risk-taking on Wall Street. Hard to legislate against the sale of securities. What specifically could you do to prevent what's happened recently from happening again in the future?
Well, I disagree that you can't regulate some risk-taking. Look, during the Great Depression, we put in place regulations related to banks that said, we're going to provide insurance so you don't have a bunch of people starting a run on your bank, but in exchange for that, we're going to look carefully at your books, and we're going to make sure that you have certain capital requirements and other steps that make sure that you're acting responsibly in exchange for this insurance, this backstop that the federal government's provided. The problem that we have is that those 20th century regulations never adapted to a 21st century financial environment. So now the traditional bank accounts for only a small portion of the overall financial sector. I think it's going to be important for us to make sure that if we are a backstop, let's say on an investment bank, that investment bank has certain capital requirements and other requirements to assure that they are not taking wild risks. What we don't want is a situation where they are able to say, heads I win, tails the taxpayer loses. And this whole process of deregulation is one that I think could have been thought through. John McCain has said that he is always a deregulator. That was his philosophy. Phil Gramm, one of his main economic advisors, took that same approach. The truth of the matter is that we have had an ideology that says regulation is always bad. And my argument is that smart regulations can, in fact, improve the marketplace because they improve transparency. They gives people a sense of if they're buying something, they know what's in there. And this is one of those situations where we can strengthen the marketplace, strengthen capitalism by making sure that the federal government has some oversight.
What do you do about the part of the problem that's broader than Wall Street, that goes to the fact that our society has been consuming more than we've been producing. People have been spending more than they're earning on bigger houses, more gadgets. You don't get votes by telling people that they ought to downscale their expectations, but how do you deal with that part of the problem?
Well, I think what we can do is to make sure that people's income are rising. I actually think that this is sort of a myth that's evolving. That the problem here is that the American people have been spendthrifts. Half of bankruptcies are occurring because people get sick